Hand it over to you. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure to talk. This is a subject that I'm very passionate about, so I hope you guys all like it. But really, when we started talking about this, we wanted to talk mostly about CMMC. Anybody who's been following CMMC knows that it's kind of had some hiccups, shall we say, in the last few months. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the cybersecurity side, talk about how CMMC will impact your DoD and that infrastructure sales cycle as well. But a little bit about me. Most people know me as Cam or Kevin A. McGrail. I am a distinguished senior fellow at Thomas University. I'm also a cyber auxiliarist with the U.S. Marine Corps, as well as a cloud fellow at DIDO, which is my day job. I additionally do a lot of volunteer work with things like the Apache Software Foundation on the Spam Assassin project. My research protects about 30% of the domains every day on the internet. And I also volunteer for Google because they're hurting for money and whatnot, but I'm an ambassador, a top contributor, and a developer expert there. But today, what I really wanted to do was sit down and say, okay, including your journey with CMMC, what with you're doing with your network, what could be 15 tips that I could give you to start with? And so that's really what I started with, And so as we go through it, the first thing we'll start with is what is cybersecurity and how are you building it into your company? And the recommendation I give, number one, is it should be part of your risk management and your governance. Everything we do in business is about accepting risk and, understanding your risk, understanding how much exposure you have is a lot of the concept here. So, do you have an approach to risk management? Have you considered cybersecurity there? Are you doing it just for compliance? Are you doing it just for regulatory or contractual reasons? Additionally, a big one, are you being reactive to this issues? Or are you being somewhat strategic? Are you thinking about what problems might occur and what things are coming down the pipeline so that you can protect your business and stay a step ahead of hopefully your competition as well? And then finally, when you have plans for cybersecurity, just make sure that you're visiting them, that you're creating them and starting there. But that kind of leads into where a lot of people are very, shall we say, nervous. And that kind of leads very well into the second tip, which is, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. Start somewhere. Any plan is better than no plan at all. And, as the famous military saying goes, no good battle plan ever survived its first encounter with the enemy. Most incident plans are the same way, but they get you used to going with what's going on. They get you used to the thinking process you need to. So, what we normally do, and if I'm sitting down with a customer and I'm starting to figure out what their cybersecurity plans need to look like, I look at and I just ask them, what are the cyber issues you've had in the last year? Okay, you've had a phishing incident, or you had, somebody's email compromised, or you had a specific problem. Great. How did you deal with that issue? How can we deal with that if that happens again? Start just with that, then expand that to the last 2 years, last 5 years. Usually you don't have to go much farther than that. That'll usually get you a pretty good idea. But, a lot of times it's things like, did the CEO lose his laptop and leave it in an Uber one time? And were you able to remote wipe it? Did it lead to a problem? Did you have to do a breach disclosure? Those kind of things, how did you handle it? And how would you handle it going forward? So things like phishing attacks, set up phishing training. If you, have the lost phone example or the lost laptop, start an incident plan, and, a lot of times I joke, it's not very funny. I will use humor, I hope, at least a little bit during this call, but I'm very serious about what I do in cyber. But nobody wants to listen to me for the next hour, talk without any humor. But, the keep calm and carry on is something we do a lot in incident response plans. So sometimes having a plan that says you have no plan for this is actually helpful, because now that you have to think on your feet and you don't stress looking for something that doesn't exist. So even if you have an incident and you think it might happen again and you just say, we have not figured out a way to deal with this, sometimes helps, because then if you actually are presented with it in a real case scenario, you don't spend time researching what might have been done before. But probably the biggest thing, especially in this year, is don't focus on topical threats. Don't focus on the 100-year threats. Don't worry about things like the pandemic. And no FUD, that stands for no fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That you're not trying to scare people. You're trying to actually make people less scared by thinking about scenarios that are realistic, how they were dealt with before, so that you can deal with it better and better each time it comes up. But all of this does take money, and that leads to the third tip. The third tip really is to set up a budget for cybersecurity. If you have no budget for cybersecurity, what I typically recommend is you use a percentage of your IT budget. If you don't have an IT budget, start with how dependent are you on IT? So for example, if your company, if your computer systems went down and you're dead in the water, you're probably not doing your risk assessment very well, and you probably haven't allocated enough funds towards your IT division to keep your company running. And then, if you were to get hacked, how dependent would that, how bad would that be for your business, et cetera? If it's an existential threat and you're not spending any money on it, that's probably a fiscally irresponsible decision. So, what I would ask you is, what is your budget for cybersecurity? Again, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. If you don't have a baseline, you can figure out what did you spend last year, and then you can carve out a percentage of that for cybersecurity. You can get some ideas from other people as well. What do they spend? What are your industry peers spending on cybersecurity? What are they spending on their IT division? Use that to set up guidelines. Budgets are very important. One of my other talks that I give a lot, I talk about effectuation theory versus causation theory. Effectuation theory, a doctor named Dr. Saraswati, she's at Darden School at UVA, invented it about 20 years ago. And the concept behind it is pretty simple. The idea with causation is that you figure out what your goals are, and then you line up the resources for it. The idea with effectuation is you figure out what resources you have and what you can do with it. And they're not really versus, they oftentimes are very complementary. For example, with chefs, if you have a causation chef, they will decide they want to make a specific recipe. They'll go to the grocery store and they'll buy all the stuff for that recipe. On the other hand, a effectuation chef will look at what items can I make with what's in the refrigerator and the pantry. So two different things, but oftentimes very important. So if I am dealing with a cybersecurity incident, a lot of times I have to start with an effectuation theory. What resources do I have? What knowledge do we have? And then we have to reiterate on that. So every hour we meet again to see, okay, what have we changed? What new information do we have? What resources have been roused out of bed and have gotten to the office, et cetera? All that type of stuff. We're dealing with, moving targets and moving resources as well. So they can be very, very helpful. But what is probably the most helpful is to do recovery exercises. A lot of times with these exercises, we start up with just tabletop, just simple paper exercises, and we discuss it, and we have people show us something. So one of the ones that I did last year, in fact, was what happens if a storm hits, and then we went through a whole bunch of scenarios, and people were able to think about like, oh, well, I can go to a Starbucks and I can get internet access there, and I've got to remember to bring my VPN stuff. But a lot of times, we start digging into these questions. We create scenarios. Hey, you log in and you've got a warning on your system that says something. What do you do? You believe the company website has been defaced. What do you do? And a lot of times it's okay. They should have a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan. They should know where it is and they should know how to look it up. And a lot of times these fail in pretty dramatic ways. One of the things that I found quite interesting is phone systems go down and people don't have a way of contacting anybody else. So, things like, do you have your manager and two of your peers' phone numbers handy or a way to contact them alternately? Do you have your business continuity plan and your disaster recovery plan printed? You don't want to have a plan that's sitting up on a server and then the server crashes. That's not going to be very helpful. But these type of scenarios can really help. You just run through the users and you can make specific ones like, hey, a user asked to do this, or you find signs that your data is encrypted, and just think about it and talk about it. But like one of the things I like to talk to a lot of companies about, and this ties in very well to things like CMMC, as well as other security frameworks, is critical staff. So for example, if you don't have depth of bench on your organization, not only is that a risk to your organization, it might be a requirement when you start doing other security policies like CMMC. And in the technical world, we use a thing which I find hilarious called bus factor. For those who don't know in the audience, bus factor is, if you have XYZ team or business unit, how many people on that team or business unit can be hit by a bus before the team stops being able to function? That's also known as, in nicer circles, the winning the lottery factor. How many people on the team can win the lottery? But I'm very I should say, very aware of this issue. There's a story at my company, I call it the tomorrow story, where I got extraordinarily ill. I was in the critical care unit at Johns Hopkins. I had an extraordinarily rare disease. I did not return to work for almost 15 months. But what was very interesting is that if you were a customer and you called my office and you asked to talk to me, the answer you would get is they would tell you I would be back in tomorrow. With no idea that tomorrow would be correct. And, those type of exercises are very important. If you have a critical person that's not in the office, what do you do? And sometimes it can be pretty simple. Like, sometimes we talk to companies like, what do you do if the person who does HR and payroll is out of the office and, has gotten in a car accident, won't be available for 6 weeks? How will you process payroll? Do you know who processes your payroll? Do you know how to do the forms? And sometimes it can be pretty simple. And like, a lot of times we talk about, thinking outside of the box, doing things in a very easy way. So for example, in a real world scenario with payroll where the person could not produce payroll, we were able to call their payroll company and say, please do payroll identically to the last one that you did. It wasn't perfect. We had to do some catch ups. We had to do some fixes. But it got 99.9% of the problems dealt with. So that's sometimes, again, going back to that, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. Sometimes you're just going to have to do the best you can with a bad situation. But the goal of all of these exercises is really the gold standard that we did here. So last year, before the ice storms that hit Texas and everything, we had done a tabletop exercise at Dido, and we did a roses and thorns. Anybody here that's a Boy Scout or anything, camping trips, we do a roses and thorns. Each kid, what did they love? What did they hate? And, a lot of times you find out some very interesting things that, different people have different perspectives on things, hey, we had a big giant downpour and all of our tents got, flushed away down in the lake. And of course, all the parents, that's like the biggest thorn for them. And all the kids are like, it was awesome going down and swimming in the lake to re-get all our tents back, things you wouldn't predict. But, what you're looking for in a disaster recovery exercise is something like this one here. So this is directly from the roses and thorns. It was done. No bad things that could have been avoided. That's what you're looking for. I mean, you're not going to come up with every scenario, but what you're going to do is you're going to get people used to thinking on their feet, thinking about what to do when situations happen, and making sure that they're not freezing up. I felt that my staff, when I got ill several years ago, really froze when they told people the tomorrow story. It goes back to a lot of parables. Do you take the $5,000 and bury it in the sand, or do you invest it and risk losing it? They should have risked losing it. They should have risked talking to the customers, but instead they didn't respond to customers. They didn't put in RFPs that should have been done. They might not have done them perfectly. They might not have done them the way I would do it, but they needed to know not to freeze. Those disaster recoveries, would help. That was a special case, but it is a real case that has happened. But one of the biggest problems that I deal with probably in the IT sector in general is appropriate resources. By the way, I do consider cybersecurity basically a subset of IT. That's why we saw it in the budget section. That's why we talked about here. For those of you that are in the audience that are old like me, you probably remember Richard Simmons and his point system for doing dieting. We did a similar baseline about 20 years ago, and we modernized it with virtual machines. But the idea behind it was we found that one full-time IT person could basically deal with 55 points of issues. And basically every desktop that they had to maintain was 1 point. Every server that they had to maintain was 5 points. And every virtual machine that they had to maintain was 4 points. A lot of people are very surprised by the fact that VMs is only a 20% reduction on the number of points, but it still has the same issues. You still got to back it up. You still got to make sure it's patched. You still got to make sure it's fit for service, et cetera. And just because you don't have to maintain the underlying hardware doesn't necessarily make that any easier. But what we find out is that, as you start going through this is a great system that we've used for decades now to identify if you're properly resourced. So if you have, 350 desktops and you have 25 servers at your office and 20 of them are VMs, you can do the math here and figure out how many IT people you should probably be staffing with. If you're under these type of numbers, you're probably building up what we call technical debt. And that generally does not bode well either for the IT or for your cybersecurity posture, because unfortunately, some of the number one things that get missed are the routine maintenance. Things like using anti-malware, using anti-spam, using anti-phishing prevention techniques, those are pretty simple. But you also need to make sure that you do backups, you need to patch your systems, you need to document your processes. And engineers, we hate to document things, but if you start a good process where documentation is done first, then you implement it. And always reiterate, it fixes a ton of problems. We'll talk about some of the other issues it fixes. But also, if you're looking for other resources as well, there's a thing called NCATS, it's the National Cybersecurity Assessment and Technical Services. You can find that over on CISA.gov. CISA is one of the newer U.S. agencies. It's been getting a lot of press recently, especially because of the Ukraine war. But they're set up to do cybersecurity for the U.S. government. That includes the private sector. They have public-private partnerships as well, and they produce a lot of great resources to help you stay secure. All right, tip number 6. Backups. So you heard me mention it before, but backups are pretty much going to be the number one way that you stop hackers, cryptoware, ransomware, etc. And cold backups, a friend of mine has a quote that I love, which is you can't hack a station wagon. Of course, I'm showing my age again, even using the term station wagon, but the whole thing is cold backups. They need to be not accessible. They need to be, not online. A lot of the hackers do look for online backups. They look to compromise those as well. They look to make sure that they've encrypted those data, and then you may not decide it or find it for a while. But a lot of companies, a lot of organizations have a plan that, hey, we get hacked, we have cyber insurance, we're going to pay ransoms, things like that. That has been something that I have been, talking about for quite a long time as being very dangerous. But also additionally, last fall, OFAC did come out with the fact that sanctions and guidance were a major risk. There is the treasury.gov that you can see down there as well. But it is a problem with things like CFIUS, as well as with the American Terrorism Act, as well as with OFAC that does sanctions. Right now, we're in a new world. I mean, over the last week, we've now entered into a war in Ukraine with some of the sanctions that are occurring. If you end up paying an organization that somehow ends up being on one of those sanctions lists, not only does it pierce a corporate veil, it can pierce a corporate veil. It can be considered personally liable. On top of that, it can lead to what's called primary and secondary liabilities. So the primary liabilities is pretty simple, but say, for example, you pay a ransom to a group and then that group hacks another company. If they find out that you paid the ransom, that other company can sue you for facilitating the bad actors and funding them. So there are significant risks around paying ransoms. It should not be part of your plan. And in fact, one of the stories that I do like to talk about is the Charles Lindbergh story. Most people know him as, very famous pilot. I think he was the first one to fly the English Channel, and then I think later across anyway, it doesn't matter. Famous pilot, we'll leave it at that. But a story that a lot of people don't know is that Charles Lindbergh's child was kidnapped, and this was really at the onset of the Great Depression, and people were kidnapping kids, holding them for ransom. One of the things that came out of this was that when his child was kidnapped and killed, it made front page news around the world. And very quickly, you saw an absolute shift in paying ransoms occur. Some of you might recognize this from things like, Tales of Little Red Chief and stuff like that, was a humorous, take on this issue. But it was becoming a big problem. People were having their kids kidnapped for ransoms. When this occurred, Lindbergh's, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And it's kind of interesting from a federalist society, as the United States is, that we saw an immediate shift where the states gave up the investigation of minors' kidnappings to the FBI. At which point it became very famous that any child kidnapping would immediately involve the FBI. They no longer could simply go across state lines to get away from it. And they would literally have all of Hoover's men, or whatever, going after them, all the G-men, I think, after them. And it became a major watershed moment. They also did things like made it illegal to pay those ransoms. And you've probably seen this in movies and stories of the time where people just want to pay the ransom, but it's a very slippery slope. And we're seeing that right now with ransoms. People paying ransoms are facilitating more people wanting to do ransoms, things like that. as well as bad actors more emboldened, because a lot of these things are scaled economies. What might be $20 to a US person, that's enough to buy a nice lunch, might be literally a month's wages in other countries. So there's a lot of vested interest in going after this. All right, enough about that. So key point is don't pay ransoms. But another one, and this one is a little bit more controversial for a lot of people who are older in the IT world, but you need to have good password policies. And the first thing in there is you need to use multi-factor authentication. A lot of people have used this, time-based protocols, et cetera, Google Authenticator, RSA Secure ID tokens, et cetera. Those concepts stop about 99.9 and a whole bunch more nines % of the hacks that are out there. So use these concepts. They're very inexpensive, if not even free on many platforms. Users are getting used to them. And especially if you start with why and explain to users why it happens, it's a great way of getting them to use multi-factor authentication. But one of the ones that's a little more controversial is to use passphrases. So over here on this right-hand side, this is a diagram I keep because this is what a lot of people have been taught. Use a certain number of characters, use uppercase, lowercase, use a one, use a special character, et cetera, and you'll get a very strong password. Well, the problem is you get a strong password for computers. What you don't get is you don't get a strong password for humans. And the problem is that we have trained ourselves poorly to have passwords that are strong for computers but hard for humans. I'll put that in a very succinct statement. Any password that you have to write down is less secure than a password that you can memorize. So what is a good password that you can memorize? Well, it's things that are called passphrases. So for example, we'll talk about it on the next slide a little bit, but you've probably been taught not to use your anniversary, for example, or your birthday as a password. Well, they're talking about simplistic things like 1213, things like that. Don't use a 4-digit word as your passphrase. It's trivial to hack. But passphrases can be a lot stronger. I'll show you some science on that in a second. Additionally, routine changing of passwords. If you're still working at a system or have a system that does things like requires you to change your passwords every 30 or 60 days, the science is proven that that is less secure. Additionally, NIST, we'll talk about NIST a couple of times during this slide deck. That's the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They have a special publication called 863 for digital identity guidelines. That's a fancy way of saying things like password policies. And in that, you'll find that it was changed several summers ago now, I think 4 summers ago, that routine password changes without a reason to change them is less secure. Additionally, Microsoft did a very good study that was excellent. Ars Technica has a great link here. You don't have to write down these links. We'll send out the slide decks later. But with that, mandatory password changes have been proven. So some ammunition if you want to change that. Definitely NIST backs it up. Microsoft backs it up. It's definitely something that I've been espousing for a couple of years as well. But going back to the passphrase example, when is your anniversary is kind of the question. So I tell people a really great passphrase that you can use would be something like, my wedding anniversary is January 1, 1990. And by doing that, you serve a couple of reasons. First of all, my wedding anniversary is January 1, 1990 is extremely long. That is hard to brute force. It's easy to remember for you without having to write it down. And the third thing is it makes you not forget your anniversary, so you have no excuses. But as you can see here, XKCD, it's a great technical comic. It's kind of like Dilbert on steroids. A lot of people would say that that password that's in elite speak that says Troubadour &3 would be a very, very strong password. But several years ago, when this was done, what they showed was that 4 random English words, all in lowercase, correct horse battery staple, was 44 bits of entropy, I think, versus the Troubadour &3 was only 28 bits of entropy. And in comparison, back when this was written, that was the equivalent of literally like 3 days worth of hacking versus 550 days, for 550 years of hacking. So passphrases, the science is there. And like I said, you don't have to write them down. There's also more in-depth things you can do. Like, for example, I often tell people they should have one passphrase. They should use that as an encryption key to decrypt a passphrase, a log of your passphrases. So if you're using a passphrase manager or a password manager, use it with a passphrase that is not written down anywhere. Or you can do something more complicated. Like I like to use things like a Caesar cipher. That's a simplistic switch. I use a passphrase plus an algorithm that I use for each system. So, something simple would be like, your password for Amazon is your passphrase plus Amazon backwards. It's probably not a great example to use, but you can see how it's a simple cipher that adds to your, adds on top of your passphrase, gives you a unique password for every system you use, and yet is very, very strong cryptographically. Another one I like to mention, I was the federal SME that brought the first US federal agency onto Google's cloud. I helped Google get their authority to operate, and I can unabashedly testify that without any question, the cyber posture was better than we could do it alone. And that was with the resources of a federal agency, with the expertise that was involved, period, end of story. The cloud can be a great way of improving your cyber posture. There's tools like BigQuery from Google that can really help you do planet scale stuff, get data out of your SIMs, visualize it. Small, sales pitch. If anybody's interested in learning about Dido's BigQuery in a box, it's an accelerator for using BigQuery safely. We give you a $500 credit and some engineering help just to sit down and talk to us about the product, do a demo. No heavy sales or anything like that. All right, that's the last of my sales for the presentation. Other than that, use Chromebooks. There is nothing more secure out there than Chromebooks as far as a platform goes and preventing hacking. The culture of cybersecurity, we'll definitely talk about this across one or two other slides as well. But this is something I really like to make sure is done. You want to start with transparency. You don't want people feeling like they have to hide what's going on. If they can't talk to their IT about hacks, you've got a problem. If people are getting sanctions or retribution because they got hacked or phished, you're going to find that they stop talking. So you want to make sure that they have a good open line of communications with leadership, with the IT staff, with the cybersecurity staff. Additionally, you want to really understand the psychology of scams. This is something that we teach a lot when we do our phishing prevention training. And the simple matter is that most scams for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, are predicated on separating your emotion from your logic. That's it. That's their key goal. And they do that by hitting certain levers and pulling certain levers that you have so they can get you to turn off your logic and do something quickly. And when we do incident response, one of the saddest phrases that we hear far too often is 10 seconds after I did it, I knew I shouldn't have. But the problem is they already did it. So a lot of what we try and do is get people to understand that and get that 10 seconds. There's a lot of strategies for doing that. But one of those strategies that doesn't work is having passive aggressive IT people. It's funny, it's tropey. It's, I love shows like the IT Crowd. Great show, by the way, very funny for IT people, hilarious for people who don't work in IT, British humor at its finest and whatnot. But if you actually have people in your IT department that pick up the phone and ask people if they've turned it on and off again and then hang up on them, that's not going to be a good concept for your IT division. On top of that, you need supportive leadership. You need leadership that's not going to get mad at people for getting phished, because there are a lot of bad actors trying to get people and catch them, and you're probably going to have some exposure and something occur at some time. It's a question of how you deal with it, how you fix it, and how you prevent it. So, other than that, the main thing, and this is something we talk about all the time, is you want to aim for security programs that are built in, not bolted on. Bolted on security generally is nowhere near as secure as other types of bolted on solutions. Trying to get my slides to, here we go. All right, code of ethics. So this one's pretty simple, but basically if you're IT, if you're cybersecurity, if you don't have a code of ethics, implement one. I love the USENIX, or the System Administrators Guild, SAGE. This also started out as the large installation System Administrators Guild, LISA as well, but it's all under USENIX. You can go find it simply. I've been using it now since about 1996 in various organizations. It is amazing. I call it the IT 10 Commandments. So I think there's like 14 of the points, but they're very time-proofed and they're very, very simple. And if you have IT and cyber people that won't agree to a code of ethics, you need to fire them. So take a look at USENIX if you've never been introduced to any type of IT code of ethics. This basically fixes the problem of who watches the watchers, who guards the guards. A lot of IT and cybersecurity people have keys to the castle, and you want to make sure that they're doing it correctly. And this code of ethics has steered me correctly over decades. Especially in gray areas. Computers and cybersecurity is a very heavily evolving technology over the last few years, last few decades. And this has steered me correctly by following this, even when, for example, policies, procedures, or laws didn't exist that would steer you correctly. Other than that, of course, Spinal Tap, you want to go to 11. I teach a cybersecurity class, and the students in the class very correctly pointed out that when I made a top list, I didn't include having a firewall, because I guess I just never envisioned that you would have a network without a firewall. But have a firewall on your network. I was shocked to find out that some of the solutions that are out there, wonderful solutions, I won't name a company, but that you can plug into these things out of the box. And every once in a while you find a network or a customer that's just literally plugged right into their cable modem or right into their fiber modem, and they didn't realize they should have a firewall between those two. So in any case, once you have a firewall, and hopefully most of you all do, start looking at zero trust networks. Zero trust networks was a concept actually invented way back in 2008. It's gaining a lot of traction recently. There was a White House initiative requiring that all agencies have a plan in the next 60 days, last May, on how they were going to move towards a zero trust network. And zero trust networks is kind of the opposite of what we call an M&M network or a perimeter network. The real reason we call it an M&M network is it's hard candy shell on the outside, it's soft and gooey chocolate on the inside. So once you break through the perimeter, it's a bad actor's dream. They can move horizontally through the network, they can exfiltrate data. They're already trusted. It's kind of like you have a bouncer, but once you're past the bouncer, you're done. So, if you think about it from the bouncing standpoint, there's a bouncer at the front, the bartender is enabled to check IDs. Maybe there's a VIP room with another bouncer, et cetera. That would be the concept of zero trust. Basically you don't trust anybody at any point. You're constantly rechecking credentials. You're doing micro segmentation. You're splitting up data. You're identifying your data toxicity. That has to do with, what data would be the most existential risk to your company should it leak. And you're making sure that it's protected appropriately and constantly doing those checks. I can talk about this concept all day long, but it's kind of what happens with an NGFW or next generation firewall. Older firewalls are what we call stateful packet inspection. They look at 5 pieces of data, what we call a 5-tuple, and that is the port IP address, the source IP address, the source port, the destination IP address, the destination port, and the protocol involved. So that's the 5 pieces of information used to decide whether or not your stateful packet inspection firewall will let that packet come through. A next generation firewall can implement zero trust concepts, which use something called a Kipling tuple. That's based after a poem from Rudyard Kipling. And it basically is the who, what, when, where, and why concepts and how. So, this person is from the marketing division and is working at noon to access a social media site. And that can be used as a decision to let that person have that, that access work or block that access, maybe as part of their business job or not. But, if all of a sudden that person is now accessing the same exact data, but they're doing it from Ukraine at 2:00 in the morning, that's probably a risk. So Kipling tuples, next generation firewalls, zero trust lets you use those type of data points to make decisions. We'll talk about another kind of like what I jokingly refer to as zero trust light in a little bit. But number 12, this one's where I'm going to talk a little bit. Originally, like I said, when I started doing this speech several months ago and was looking at it, was very excited about it. But the concept was to really talk a lot more about CMMC. CMMC has had a lot of shakeup in the last few months. We've seen 1.0 go to 2.0, but with 2.0, a lot of things happen. We'll talk about that. But the biggest thing underlying CMMC is having your policies and procedures in order. And, they will save your butt when you have problems. They can also help company do very well. An example I make of that is, think about companies 100 years ago, 200 years ago. They weren't doing P&L statements. They weren't doing balance sheets. Nowadays, we consider that just a good leadership at a company, that you have that financial insight, that you can do a report probably at your fingertips and make a decision. But not that long ago in my lifetime, a P&L would be a month-long process, and somebody would manually go meet with all of the business unit leaders and would sit down and, on a monthly basis, produce a P&L and a balance sheet for the leadership to make a decision. So think about it this way. If you have policies and procedures, you can start gathering data and you can be making intelligent business decisions based on that. And it can help guide your company and do so very, very well. And a really key example that I can make that's even that complicated is just the tribal knowledge. A lot of policies and procedures, are just stuck in one person's head. That person's out sick. Do you have policies and procedures that can be used? How do you train new staff? How can you grow your company to have more people? But also, how can you demonstrate your policies and procedures? Things like CMMC will require you to demonstrate that your policies exist. So the policies are how, policies are the why. They show why you do something. Procedures are the how you do something. And then you may have to demonstrate that you've actually done it and show that you have artifacts that demonstrate that, for example, you had training and that, people met and reviewed these documents every year because your policy says, hey, we meet every year to review our business continuity plan. I, as an auditor, will come in and say, great, prove to me that you did it annually, et cetera. And anyway, I could talk about that all day long. All right, but let's talk about a little bit more. So if I'm doing policies and procedures, this is a document that I sometimes bring up to scare people. But what I want to do here is kind of drill down a little bit into it. If I'm hired by your company and I'm doing a policies and procedures baseline, these 31 items is what I start with. There may be more. And some of these policies and procedures, the reason it's not as scary as it might sound, these might be one paragraph in an employee handbook, for example. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have 31 policies and procedures, but it definitely means that you've thought about these. And, like some of these in here, we talked about the disaster recovery planning review. We talk about some other things that are in here. So one that I like to point out a lot is OT and IT network interconnection review. Most people think about cyber and they think about what's called IT cyber, information technology. IT cyber is what most people think about, your antivirus, your malware, your anti-spam, those kind of systems that you're used to, your firewalls. OT is operational technology. One of my former bosses has a great definition for operational technology that I like to use, which is OT is anything that touches the physical world. So for example, a automated building access system, a motor operated valve, a garage door opener. These are operational technology. The real risk that we've been seeing growing in the last decade, even in just the last year or two, has been the interconnection between OT and IT networks. People are getting things like, Google Homes that tie into a home automation system so that they can turn off and on lights and close and lock doors. In fact, Google learned the hard way that, robbers were walking up to houses and yelling, okay, Google, unlock the front door. And if people had automation systems, they were unlocking the front door. And now my Google is going off over here. Google's solution was fairly elegant and simplistic at the same time. What they did is they made it so you can only lock doors. You can't unlock doors with the automation system. So it's things like that that we look at. But, the key thing is here is, do you have these policies? Have you thought about these issues? And some of them are ones that companies have never thought about. What is your 911 emergency procedure? If you have a building fire, what do you do? If you have an incident, the number one goal of any cybersecurity person, it's pithy, it's maybe not that funny, but I generally tell people is number one goal is to keep your client out of the newspaper. So what do you do when you end up in the newspaper and you've got reporters, lining the door as people come in? Do you have a policy about who can talk to them and who can't? Some of these things can be very, very damaging if people that are not aware of, what reporters will twist and things like that. I don't mean to be mean to reporters, but, for example, there's no such thing as off the record. And, as an engineer, as a cybersecurity expert, I want to think long and hard before I tell them something, because what I might say might make a lot of sense to me in the cybersecurity world, but it'll be very, very confusing or can be very easily twisted and whatnot. So certain things that are obvious to me may not be obvious and will just get reported on wrong. Anyway, additionally, CMMC. So as I mentioned, CMMC has gone through quite a bit of shakeup. What CMMC is, it's the cyber maturity, model that you have to follow if you are doing contracting with the U.S. government, especially the DoD. What is important about CMMC is that it made requirements that rippled down to your subcontractors, and they were pretty strong requirements. In fact, CMMC 1.0 and that concept was probably one of the finest cybersecurity initiatives that I've seen in this country in decades. Unfortunately, with 2.0, they did a couple of things with it. They basically, the quote that's on here somewhere, do more, more time to do less. They've defanged it a lot. They've added concepts of self-assessment. They've lowered the requirements, et cetera. But, the reason I put this in here with the policies and procedures section is that all of your cybersecurity models, CMMC being one of them, are going to be based on having good policies and procedures. and following them and being able to demonstrate you're following them. So for example, with CMMC at the lowest level, it's going to follow 17 basic security guidelines or controls or whatnot that come out of the federal acquisition requirements or the FAR, what's called the FAR 52. And, that's kind of the lowest end. What's that basic safeguarding of what's called contractor information and contractor information systems. All of that is actually a subset of a NIST publication. I told you we talk about those a little bit, the 800-171. There are multiple revisions of the 171, like 1 and 2 and whatnot. And depending on the level you're going for with CMMC or required to go through based on your contracts, you will have to follow one or the other version. In that, what you have to do, the 800-171 is about protecting what we call QE or controlled unclassified information in non-federal systems. So you're a government contractor and you've got access to sensitive data. How do you have to protect it? The 800-171 is how you do that. Additionally, the next enhancement up is the 800-172. That is actually a supplement to the 172. Again, enhanced requirements. These things build on other statements, things like, for example, if you're going for FedRAMP certification, you might have heard of things like the 800-153. That's the special publication on protecting information systems. It used to have a different name with Rev 4, where it's protecting federal systems. Now it's information systems in organizations with Rev 5. But all of this can be very, very overwhelming. What I generally like to tell people is a couple of things. If you'd like this list, happy to do it. How many of these points are you hitting? Cybersecurity is not about checking boxes. It's about moving the cybersecurity and making yourself more secure. So some of the things that I like to point out is the payment card industry data security specifications, also known as PCI DSS, is a requirement for any company that takes credit cards. So it's an easy one to get. It's free. It's self-assessed, so you can go get the questionnaire. But it's got a lot of devil in the details. You've got to read it. It'll have things in there like, for example, one of the ones is like, do you use secure Wi-Fi? And a lot of companies that I talk to are like, yes, we use secure Wi-Fi. And I say, well, did you read the actual control? Because it says, do you implement 802.11i security certificates? I think is the exact spec. And they're like, what is 802.11i? And they're like, well, if you can't answer that question, you haven't implemented it. And so people fail that. And that's where CMMC, I think, is going to be a double-edged sword. Other people besides me talk about this, but the double-edged sword with it is going to be that when you do a self-assessed questionnaire, a lot of times people are too lenient and an auditor is going to be much harsher. So you might consider using an auditor, even if it's an informal audit, even if you could do a self-assessment. But start out with something like PCI DSS, start out with an internal review, start out with talking to industry peers about what they're doing, and start out with things like what has occurred at your company in the last year or two. Make sure that you're addressing those issues adequately. It will set you up very, very well. Finally, number 13, this is that what I call the Zero Trust Network Lite. Use a VPN. Don't use a commercial VPN unless you trust it very much. There's only one that I really trust from PIA, which is a London-based company. But most enterprise firewalls have the VPN capabilities built in. Make it a requirement that your users have to connect to that VPN to do their day-to-day work, and then limit access to systems that don't need access by people outside your company to require the IP addresses from your VPN. It's very, very simple. It basically becomes one of those decision points I was talking about with the Kipling tuple. Well, you're only allowing IPs that have gotten your VPN. It's another form of multi-factor authentication. So it's just another hurdle that stops hackers from getting into the system. And it's probably going to stop a lot of things from being very, very existential, dangerous threats to your company if they got leaked just by doing this. So use a VPN. Additionally, the number one risk, so email, something like 80 to 95% of your hacks start with email or phishing. That's the initial vector for the attack. So it is by far your number one. After that, what we normally see is what we call a failure to offboard. So accounts that are left on, passwords that are left at default, contractors that have come and gone, those accounts are left and nobody's monitoring them and nobody knows who's accessing them. So, make sure that your policies and procedures have concepts of offboarding being done and make sure they're being done. It not only is it a cost saving measure, but it can be a huge, huge security benefit. My final tip of my top 15 here today is really to combat shadow IT. If you've never heard the term before, shadow IT is basically when you don't fulfill your users' needs and they go figure out the solution on their own. When they do that, the big problem is that you get you lose visibility, you lose control, you lose the security over your data. One of the ways you can do this is by making sure that you are aligned with and embracing your users' constant needs. Passive aggressive ITs who are very resistant to change are not going to be able to combat shadow IT. We want users to come to us. And going back to the concept we talked about with building a culture of cybersecurity, some of the things, simple things that I've done over the years, a user, I should say, comes to me and says, hey, I want to use this really cool XYZ widget. And I go, great. What I want you to do is I want you to research it from a security standpoint, find out what risks it has, and then find it out there, competitive landscape, do some research on other tools that do the same thing, and come back to me and let's talk in a week about it. And a lot of times the users come back and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I looked into it. I found 2 other companies that do the same thing. This other company is so much more secure and costs half the amount of money, because you make them part of the cybersecurity process, and you make sure that they know that, hey, you're not just giving them lip service. You're going to take that information. IT evolves all the time. We're constantly looking for what will make our users' job easier, and we've got to balance the security with that. And if the users are brought into that security analysis that's happening, that risk analysis that occurs, the cost analysis that occurs to getting the things, they can start looking at what will make their job easier, simple, faster, and it becomes a culture of cybersecurity, because we want our users to know why we're doing something, because when they know why we're doing something, they aren't as aggressively anti doing those security measures. So, the next steps, I'm going to have some final thoughts here in a moment, but, start your journey today. I talked about the fact that, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. Cyber is never done. You're not going to finish it. So it's a journey you need to start. Even if you implement just one policy, that's going to move your cyber needle in the right way. And, processes and procedures. I can't harp on that enough. They will serve you correctly in many situations. Other than that, money handlers are your big targets. Attacks on payroll is nothing new. There's a reason banks have been dealing with the robbers for 100 years, and payroll, they have procedures and whatnot that deal with these issues, and banks to try and mitigate loss. So the experience and these controls that happen from cybersecurity are there to protect you. Learn from them, learn from past mistakes and whatnot. So I don't know, Stephen, if you're there, but what I'd like to do next is I've got some final closing thoughts, but before I do that, I wanted to see if there were any questions from the audience, any rants, any heckling, etc.
Sure. Can you hear us, Kevin?
I can.
Okay. Thank you. So any questions? I know we have some cybersecurity background or personnel here. You have any questions for Kevin?
I just want to ask you what books are you reading right now?
Current books that you're reading right now.
Oh gosh, I love a lot. I like, I would say that if I was going to recommend something that's interesting and you've never read any cybersecurity books, I love The Cuckoo's Egg, by Clifford Stahl. Great book. Just really the introduction to it, to cybersecurity really in general, is what Cliff wrote. Also, John Carlin has a book called Dawn of the Code Wars. He was a district attorney, now in the private sector, I think at mofo.com. It's a great name for a law firm, something Morrison Forrester, I think. But he's written a wonderful book about the start of the code wars. Additionally, there's a great book. I'm going to say her name is like Zettler. It's called, it's something to do with 0 days. And, for those who have never heard the true story, there's an HBO movie called 0 days. So I know you asked about books, but there's a book called, there's a movie called 0 days that's on HBO that goes into the background. A lot of it was Stuxnet, which was the hack of the Iranian enrichment uranium facility. That's probably the best public information that's ever been released. And Zettler's book on it as well is amazing. And if you do one thing after this meeting, go search Project Aurora on YouTube, because Project Aurora was a big deal because that was the first cyber attack that physically damaged operational technology. It shows a 1-minute video where they destroy a generator by using an attack. Stuxnet, for those who don't know about it, damaged uranium enrichment centrifuges through a cyber reprogramming of the PLCs. The interesting thing is it was actually a failure because it was not supposed to actually damage the centrifuges. It was supposed to just mess up with the data so that the scientists doing scientific process and what's fancily called hypothetical deductive reasoning would not be able to figure out because they'd get different results every time they ran the same experiment. That was the intent of what's colloquially called as Stuxnet. But Zettler's book goes into it. The original name of it was Olympic Gold or OG, et cetera. A very fascinating book. So those are things. Other than that, I love doing other things and reading things and seeing movies, but those are some in the cybersecurity realm that are excellent. I will, sorry, I think something. Wonderful gentleman, Rich Howard, he's now with CyberWire. He was originally the chief security officer over at Palo Alto Networks. He started a unit called Unit 42 at Palo Alto Networks that does playbooks. Additionally, the other thing that he did was he started the Canon Awards, CONON. It's a book awards for cybersecurity books. I'm pretty sure all three of the ones I just mentioned are Canon Cybersecurity Award winners. I think it's now with like University of Cincinnati or something like that, but a wonderful organization. So if you're looking for books that are well reviewed by people in the cybersecurity world, the cybersecurity canon books are excellent, and there's a few hundred on that list now. So there's always something to find to read there.
Any other
Stephen?
questions? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Kevin. I do appreciate this presentation.
Well, don't stop yet. I've still got some final thoughts. I just wanted to do questions first. So I do have one more slide.
Right.
So one of the questions I've gotten asked a lot, and this one, especially, it's really just a new world. I mean, CMMC is radically changed. A lot of companies are worried about hacks from nation states with the Russians, with Belarus, et cetera. We've seen, the Ukrainian war launch just a significant cyber risk in the last week. So three policies I would recommend most people look at. So if you leave this and you go back to your companies, these are three policies I think you can implement pretty easily. Two of them are really easy, one's a little harder. But policy number one, ban the purchase of any gift cards or any reimbursement for gift cards unless it's improved in writing and you have a face-to-face meeting with leadership about it. So many fishes start with this. Buy me a Walmart gift card, buy me an iPhone gift card, et cetera. This will stop one of the number one vectors for phishing that occurs right now. Number two is put in place a policy that bans any ACH or direct deposit changes both for vendors and for employees unless you have a form received in writing and you approve it and vet it, again, face-to-face. Face-to-face, by the way, can be a Google Meet or whatnot, a Zoom call where you get on the phone and, for example, big organizations, it might be the person has to hold up their ID and you have to verify this them. Then you say, okay, please verify the last 4 digits of the bank account. Never change bank accounts and whatnot. I mean, the horror stories I can tell you around payroll getting compromised, around vendor payments going to the wrong place, et cetera, are just so huge. And those two policies right there will stop a lot of the actual step queue that actually effectuates the money getting lost as part of most scams. And then the final one, it may be a little harder, but implement multi-factor authentication, something like Google Authenticator or 2SV on Google Workspace, Microsoft Authenticator, RSA Secure ID, et cetera. These three policies would do so much to move your cybersecurity needle and prevent major problems that I like to bring them up. So with that, I'll just say thank you. My email address, you can email me at cam@didoweb.com. I'm also on LinkedIn under K McGrail. You'll see that picture of Cam that was up there earlier. It's an off-brand Canadian spam that really exists. So it's a tongue-in-cheek with my anti-spam expertise and whatnot. But I love to talk to people, love to talk to other cybersecurity experts, love to move the cybersecurity needle and keep improving the cybersecurity pattern out there. So now I'm done, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Kevin.